Welcome to Speaking of Excellence. This is the official podcast of the Quality Professionals Awards for Further Education and Employability. My name is Sally, I am the Marketing Manager at Mesmer and the Quality Professionals Awards, and I support Mesmer CEO Lou Doyle to bring you the Speaking of Excellence podcast. This will be part one of 2 episodes with a group who received a highly commended award at the Quality Professionals Awards in 2024. This award recognised the collaborative project between Middlesex University, the Open University and UVAC in an innovative project to develop the recognition of prior learning for care professionals. So in this first part you'll hear our guests discussing how apprenticeships in universities have, over recent years, had a mutually disruptive relationship, but in an overall positive way. Lou and I felt that this conversation was so rich and useful to anyone with an interest in how apprenticeships in universities have grown together over the last few years that it would be worth giving this conversation its own bonus episode. As soon as you've finished listening, I hope you will feel inspired to head over to qualityprofessionalsawards.org for more inspiration and to submit your nominations for the Quality Professionals Awards 2025, which will take place in June next year. That just leaves me time to thank our wonderful headline sponsors, the IEP and OEL. Please also take a moment to find out more about their work in the FE and employability sectors. Enjoy the episode and look out for part 2 next week, where we will dive into the project itself.
Good morning, everyone. How are you doing?
Very well,
Very
thank
good.
Very well.
Good,
Monday
thank you.
morning. What were we thinking? A Monday morning podcast recording.
Bright and bushy-tailed.
Bright and bushy-tailed. Exactly what possible way could I want to set the week off more than meeting the 3 of you to record a podcast? So I'm very much looking forward to it. You can see on the screen that we have Mandy, Clare and Darryll with us. For anyone who's watching on YouTube, for anyone else who's listening, you're very welcome and we're delighted to have you here. As is the style now with this podcast, I'm going to get the guys to introduce themselves very briefly, and then we'll go into some of the questions from today. So let me come to Mandy first. So Mandy, the question is really a broad one, which is tell us a bit about what you do and how you've got to where you've got to, and actually within that perhaps say something about how your view on quality in education might have changed over that period of time as well. You know, where do you think we are now? So let me go to you first.
Thanks, Lou. Yes, it's probably worth saying that I'm not an educator. So I'm not a qualified teacher or lecturer. I spent really my whole career in policy and strategy. So I'm that archetypal policy wonk. Spent most of my career inside government or government agencies, but for the last 10 years, I have been outside of government and working inside higher education, leading the discussion around the role of universities in apprenticeships and skills. So my view on quality has absolutely shifted in the time that I've had responsibility for national policy on higher apprenticeships back in the early days of the coalition government in 2010, 11 and 2012. And since then, looking at the excellence that universities bring to both the discourse around apprenticeships and what they're capable of doing in terms of apprenticeship progression and engaging a different cohort of student, a different cohort of employer. So quality for me means actually how good are the outcomes at the end of an apprenticeship for an individual, and are they supporting what was the 2 main objectives of apprenticeships in England, productivity and social mobility.
It's not a bad start for Monday morning. Very good job, Mandy. Claire, what about for you? Tell us about you.
So I am a Senior Manager of Recognition of Prior Learning at the Open University for 7 years now, but I didn't start kind of in that role. I, for 14 years, was a lecturer in further education, but teaching students on higher education courses, but within a further education environment. So I had a real passion for that, supporting learners transition from further education into higher education programs. So that idea of kind of progression was really, really key to the work that I did. In terms of quality for me, I think it's changed over my career so far, in the sense that I think it's now viewed as more of a holistic concept where the learner is really at the centre, and where providers really strive to, create positive outcomes for learners that are equitable for all learners, but are meaningful for them in terms of not just the achievement of qualification, but the impact it has on their career progression and also social mobility.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks, Claire. Darryll, over to you.
Yes, so I'm Director of Apprenticeships at Middlesex University. I did train as a teacher. I've taught in schools, I've taught in FE colleges and in universities. It's my first job in FE was as a second year tutor on H&D graphic design course, because I was one of my other hats was I was a graphic designer previously. And so I've seen a lot of different kind of education contexts, and seen and been part of lots of discussions about what might constitute quality in further and higher education. One of the things that strikes me is that the idea of and the role of vocational education that is in some way related to work, and where that sits within the broader panoply of people's understandings of what education is for. And that's been a kind of a consistent theme throughout the different educational contexts that I've experienced. And more recently, with some of the innovations in higher and degree apprenticeships, you really see some of those discussions coming to a fore, because you see some resistance in the university sector, thinking that apprenticeships are not the same kind of quality as might be understood by traditional university degrees. I've had colleagues in various contexts tell me that understanding of quality of apprenticeships is not really relevant to higher education. I've heard all kinds of things, which is a little bit out there for me. But I think that on the more positive side, my own institution, the fact that there's a lot of innovation has gone on in higher and degree apprenticeships has contributed directly to our teaching excellence framework submission, and pointed the way towards kind of future directions of understanding about what a high quality learning experience would be for somebody at the university. So I see quite a discursive shift in understanding the positionality of quality in higher education, driven by some of the innovations that higher and degree apprenticeships have brought.
Can I jump in here, actually, Lou? Because Darryl's, sort of spoken about the discursive shifts, and probably it was wrong of me to omit the fact that just a couple of years ago, I completed a doctoral programme at the Middlesex University, of which Darryll was my supervisor, and it was called Discursive Shifts and Apprenticeship Reforms over a 10-year period. So although I'm not an educator, I feel as though actually I kind of reached the level of recognition by the Academy in terms of how we look at particular contexts and what happens in terms of who has the power to determine what a particular sort of context looks like. So I was looking at apprenticeship reforms, when the early days of growth in higher apprenticeships didn't really speak to universities, for example, but now we're in a position where we've got over 100 universities in the market to deliver apprenticeships at all levels, not just at level 6 and level 7, but we've got programmes in universities being delivered in partnership from level 3 upwards. So it's very important to say that actually Darryll has been a particular influence both on Clare and my own career trajectory in terms of the support that he's given, because of his wonderful way of explaining the context in which we work. So thank you, Darryll.
So good to hear on a Monday.
Yeah.
When Darryll and I speak, we're just normally putting the world to rights, aren't we, Darryll? It's lots of the things you said in your commentary. I was like, yeah, we've had that conversation, we've had that one. So I'm gonna unpick. It kind of carries on from where you left off there before, actually, Darryll. Mandy, I'll head this one to you first, if I may. Both Claire and you spoke about that importance of social mobility, and actually apprenticeships bringing a different cohort to the fore, and then and I'll come back to a point Darryll made in just one second. So with that in mind, talk to us a bit about the role that you think universities have played in pushing the apprenticeship agenda over that 10-year period that you described, Mandy, since the reforms happened.
So I think we're reflecting on more than a decade, actually, but the role that universities have had has been immense. It's been huge. It's changed the perception of apprenticeships in England in a very significant way. We often say that actually the involvement of all types of providers, including universities and higher education providers, has created a very aspirational programme that stretches in England from craft and trade through to technical, associate professional, professional managerial job roles, and has created progression pathways into skilled professions. And the fact that apprenticeships probably are no longer referred to as the good choice for other people's children. And when we look at first the growth of higher apprenticeships, when I was in government, leading a sort of a £25 million investment in growth of then apprenticeship frameworks at levels 4 and 5, before we recognised actually there was an interest and a demand by employers for progression pathways into degree level programmes, which SACE then was revised, the specification for apprenticeship standards in England was then revised to recognise for the first time criteria for apprenticeships at that level. But then with the launch of degree apprenticeships in 2015, I think it was recognised by government that the success of degree apprenticeships particularly depended on employers and universities working together. Employers will take the lead in designing the occupational standard, for example, taking account of the innovation and excellence universities can offer. And that, for the first time, really kind of brokered a different set of conversations. And actually, Darryll kind of introduced this concept of the arrangements being really the transformative effect on the environment of higher level skills and apprenticeships in the UK as being creatively disruptive, disrupting that relationship between higher education and the workplace and our understanding of it. And from the outset, degree apprenticeships were always intended to bring together the worlds of work and higher education under a dual policy objective. Now, that may well be changing under the new government, but then it was to attract a new cohort of workers and their employers to grow the economy by increasing productivity and to raise levels of social mobility in terms of supporting greater access to higher education. So I think we could say that certainly universities and associated with the mass sort of entry to the market by university providers has been one of the biggest changes to impact on higher education in the recent decades.
Let me ask you one more thing, actually, Mandy, kind of with your policy lens on, if you like, around it, which is when you look at those dual objectives that you described in relation to the policy coming in, yeah. You've talked there about the objectives you think that we've met, if you like, where it really has made a difference. And my view on it. I'm a huge supporter of degree apprenticeships and absolutely see that value over and over and over again in the work that we do when I'm in a mesmer space, if you like. But where do you think we aren't hitting those objectives? Where do you think the gaps are that we still need to do some work around in order to be able to get to where you think it ought to get to with apprenticeships and HE?
I've always defended, the arguments that, for example, degree apprenticeships have undergone a bit of a middle class land grab, because what we're celebrating is apprenticeships are for everybody, not for a particular defined cohort of learners that potentially have been failed by the school system, for example, not academic. This term sort of, academic programs for academic learners and vocational programs for vocational type learners, we've really tried to kind of dispel the myths around some of that. I think we need more evidence to demonstrate the effects of social mobility on particular cohorts. I certainly think UVAC's members at Middlesex and perhaps Manchester Met being the exceptions are perhaps not doing enough to promote the way in which they've attracted a different type of learner into apprenticeships in and through work. The productivity aspect, again, we've seen a real shift in the types of employers that are now engaging. We've seen a huge move by the public sector in terms of actually trying to achieve better public sector and service sort of efficiency by being engaged at all levels of apprenticeship delivery. But I don't think actually we can argue that there has been a mass sort of, grab by middle class kids leaving school with good A levels. But the expectation of employers at all levels has changed and migrated upwards. Even where you are recruiting for a level 2 type skill, the expectations on somebody to be able to achieve highly and successfully, even at that level of skill, has just become tougher.
Thank you. Darryll, before I go to Clare to talk very specifically about the project that you were highly commended, my question for you, Darryll, is to kind of go back on something that you talked about, which was the importance, and I know this predates apprenticeships for Middlesex, the intersection between employability and education has been something that you have had a long-standing passion for. So just summarise for us what you think apprenticeships, if you like, have brought to that party. So you were doing it anyway, if you like, you were already focused on that intersection. So what have they done that's helped further that agenda? And that you described innovation, if you like, that's coming through. In what ways do you think it's furthered that agenda? We'll go into your project with Clare a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, you're right in saying that, that trying to bring in relevance to the workplace, relevance for employment is not new. I mean, way back when they introduced foundation degrees, there were clear expectations about involving employers in the design of those programs, etc. Not all of those aspirations were filled by any means, but nonetheless, there was an explicit intention to bring employers into the discussion about what might constitute a high quality learning experience for people who are intending to get into employment. I think the game changing thing for higher degree apprenticeships has been it's not a kind of a nice to have. It's not something that somebody in a program approvals committee can tick a box to say, yes, we had some good conversations with employers and they like what we're intending to do, and that would be sufficient. What's actually got to happen is you've got to demonstrate that you are engaging in a kind of co-design process, but probably more significantly than that, universities are no longer the sole gatekeepers of who can access higher education for higher degree apprenticeships. Employers employ apprentices, pay their wages, and the regulatory environment that surrounds higher degree apprenticeships, although lots of people would say is overly bureaucratic, and I think that's true, nonetheless, it has created a context in which employers have been much more substantially in the driving seat than would have otherwise been the case. Now, that's in one way, that's an uncomfortable position for universities and higher education providers, because they're used to being the sole determinants of who can do this stuff. And we'll set our standards here, and I've got institutional autonomy here, and no one has any place to say anything else. But now that's not the case, because with higher degree apprenticeships, employers are, at least the sole, the kind of dual gatekeepers for who accesses the learning, and probably more than that. So that really does shift the narrative in terms of what it's for, who controls access to it, who measures whether it's good or not good, against what standards, what criteria, and so forth. And I think that has been really helpful for those universities that have been involved in delivering higher degree apprenticeships, because actually it's having a different view on something, have a different perspective on something, gives you a more broader view of it, and therefore you get a more holistic picture of what it is you're trying to look at. So if you're having to take into account an employer perspective as well as your own perspective on what quality education is about, then you're likely to reach a situation that you've got a picture that's closer to meeting all of those different stakeholder needs, it seems to me. And so when I mentioned earlier that, some universities, not all, but some universities included specific reference to their work in higher and degree apprenticeships in their teaching excellence submission, it's identifying what innovations have been brought into place as a consequence of trying to meet the needs of employers explicitly. And that's brought different perspectives on learning, different reflections on what good looks like, how you achieve high quality, etc. Whether that's, introducing a coaching approach to drive professional learning through tripartite progress reviews, for example, which is now, when we all started doing this stuff, people didn't really understand that that's maybe would be a good idea. But now it seems, that common practice and obvious in a sense. That's a significant shift. And the idea that, higher education is about transferring knowledge from one context to another, and that's sufficient, that's been significantly challenged as well. So the idea that people have to, develop knowledge and skills, so they have to apply learning in different contexts, and demonstrate that they're able to do that, to demonstrate competency, is relevant. My personal favourite, however, is behaviours, professional behaviours. Apprenticeships, as we know, have knowledge, skills and behaviours identified. And I don't think universities have been very good or consistently good at recognising the requirement for people to demonstrate professional behaviours to access professional careers. And I think having to do that because of the way that apprenticeships were set up, having to, I've heard people say, how can you assess behaviours? Well, you can observe them, you can do all kinds of things, all kinds of different ways you can observe behaviours. Of course you can. People have to do that all the time to become professionally competent. It's not new. So universities have had to think, how could we best, assess behaviours then? And what kinds of ways, what kinds of innovations should we put in place to enable people to, develop the abilities to the capability to demonstrate professional behaviours that are required. And so all of that stuff shakes things up. It shakes things up in terms of thinking that rather than thinking, yes, we're going to deliver a lecture and then we're going to have a seminar and then somebody's going to write something about it and then they'll get some feedback on it and then they'll submit their final piece of work and then everything's got to be an essay or a report. You start to think differently about authentic assessment, and it shakes things up in a as Mandy referred to it, in a creatively disruptive way, and that's productive in terms of enhancing the quality of the learning experience, it seems to me.
It's been really interesting, actually, and I would say I've noticed this more over the last 18 months, where I've seen our learning from apprenticeships in HE and universities start to inform the quality of provision in other areas of the university. So the obvious ones would be the crossover into HTQs, and that's some of it because the kind of accreditation process is not dissimilar. We're involved in it, but actually the speed that universities were able to engage with that process because of what we've gone through with apprenticeships, we're starting to see, I think Mandy touched on it before, about the tentacles, if you like, of HE are reaching beyond perhaps those more traditional spaces, and there's some interesting work going on with skills boot camps. And again, I think that learning from what we've gone through with apprenticeships has been really helpful. I made a note, actually, Darryll, on something we could do a whole podcast on this one bit around, for me, the transition that universities have had to really think through is when the employer has equal stake in and equal say in who ends up on the programme. Yes, there are lots of good things about that, but occasionally it means you end up with people on your programmes who perhaps you wouldn't have chosen to be there, because sometimes the weight of the employer had forced universities into the early days to perhaps put people on there that impacted on your quality. And it's been really interesting to see the scales of that shift and that become much more of a balanced partnership as the universities, I think, have grown in confidence about how to deliver apprenticeships and do it really well.